When Japan's admirals finally saw the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the world believed they were celebrating a triumph. But behind closed doors, their reactions were nothing like victory, because the destruction they unleashed carried a shadow they could already feel rushing back toward them. Dawn broke over Oahu on December 7, 1941, with a deceptive calm, the kind that settles over an island long before the world changes forever. At 7:55 a.m., that calm was shattered. Air raid sirens wailed across the naval yards, their echoes ricocheting off the green ridges of the Ka'lau Range. Sailors ran from barracks half-dressed, some still gripping breakfast tin cups, staring upward in disbelief as the first wave of Japanese aircraft dove out of the morning haze. Within minutes, columns of black smoke curled above Battleship Row, and the Pacific Fleet found itself trapped in a nightmare it had never fully believed could happen. But the story of that morning did not begin in Hawaii. It began years earlier, in boardrooms, embassies, and military war rooms across the Pacific. By mid-1941, Japan's empire was straining under pressure of its own expansion. The conquest of China had consumed more lives and resources than Tokyo ever anticipated. With the United States imposing an oil embargo in July 1941, Japan's leaders feared an even greater threat: industrial suffocation. Their reserve of fuel, the lifeblood of any navy, was dwindling. Within 2 years, perhaps even less, the Imperial Navy would be unable to operate beyond home waters. Diplomacy had stalled. Time had run out. It was in this climate of desperation that Admiral Yamamoto emerged as the chief architect of a plan he had prayed he would never need. A former attaché to Washington, Harvard-educated, fluent in English, Yamamoto understood American industry better than most of his colleagues. He warned the cabinet, "I shall run wild for 6 months, but after that, I can give no assurances." It wasn't bravado. It was a plea. He knew Japan could not win a prolonged war. Yet honor, duty, and strategic logic left him little room. If conflict with the United States was unavoidable, the only chance, however slim, lay in crippling the Pacific Fleet at the outset. And so the plan took shape: a sudden, overwhelming carrier strike that would knock out America's battleships before they ever left harbor. Command of the actual attack force fell to Admiral Nagumo, a cautious, traditional officer who had spent most of his career with torpedo flotillas. Nagumo was no visionary. He viewed the operation with deep misgivings. Carriers were still considered untested instruments of war, and the risks of sailing 6 of them across the North Pacific in radio silence were immense. Still, as a soldier of the Emperor, he obeyed. Aboard the carriers that morning, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Huryu, Shikaku, and Zuikaku, Japanese radio operators listened tensely as reports filtered in from the attack waves. Direct hit on Arizona. Oklahoma capsized. West Virginia listing heavily. The successes sounded almost unreal, even to those who had trained for them. On the flight deck, officers stared toward the distant horizon. There was no cheer, no celebration. Only the dull, unsettling recognition that a boundary had been crossed, a silence heavier than the roar that preceded it. Then, at 7:58 a.m., the coded signal came through the ether from the first wave's commander, Captain Mitsuo Fuchida. Tora Tora Tora. Attack achieved complete surprise. But what no one aboard Nagumo's flagship, Akagi, yet understood was this: surprise was only the beginning. And once the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor, Japan's admirals would confront consequences far greater than any of them had dared imagine. In the hours after the last wave of aircraft turned back from Oahu, the Japanese strike force vanished into the vast gray emptiness of the North Pacific. The 6 carriers of the Kido Butai, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Huryu, Shikaku, and Zuikaku, formed a tight, silent formation as they began the long withdrawal toward home. Their decks were stained with oil, hydraulic fluid, and the powder burns of spent guns. Inside the hangars, armorers resecured unused torpedoes, while mechanics checked aircraft battered by flak. Yet despite the overwhelming tactical success of the attack, there were no celebrations. The officers on Akaga's bridge spoke in clipped, controlled tones. Most knew that the Imperial Navy had just launched the most dangerous operation in its history, and that a single American carrier group appearing on the horizon could turn triumph into catastrophe. Lookouts scanned the seas obsessively. Pilots slept in their flight gear. Every man waited for the counterblow that didn't come. Then the reports arrived. Intelligence officers pored over coded transmissions from the returning strike leaders. One battleship after another was listed as sunk or crippled. Arizona, destroyed in a single cataclysmic explosion. Oklahoma, capsized. West Virginia, California, and Nevada, heavily damaged. Airfields at Ford Island, Wheeler, and Hickam were in ruins. More than 180 American aircraft destroyed. Casualty estimates rising past 2,400 dead. The numbers were staggering. The Imperial Navy had achieved what war planners had once dismissed as nearly impossible: surprise, annihilation, and escape without losing a single carrier. Aboard the Japanese ships, the officers' faces remained expressionless. Some bowed silently to one another. Others stared at the deck as if unsure how to feel. They had done their duty, yet beneath the surface lay a deeper unease, an instinctive understanding that the magnitude of the victory carried consequences far beyond the horizon. In Tokyo, the first coded summary reached the Naval General Staff. Junior officers erupted into applause. Ministers congratulated one another. Newspapers rushed to prepare special editions. But inside the upper echelons of the Navy, the atmosphere was colder, more calculated. Admiral Asami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, read the preliminary report without a change in expression. He understood the scale of the achievement, but he also understood the hard mathematics of war production. Japan had struck a blow at the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but it had not destroyed American aircraft carriers, nor the sprawling industrial network behind them. To his aides, Nagano confided quietly, "This success may be the beginning of the end." And hundreds of miles away in his flagship cabin aboard Nagato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the same report. Yamamoto had crafted the plan, refined it, and taken responsibility for its risks. Yet when he read the casualty lists and the damage assessments, he did not feel triumph, only dread. Years earlier, he had toured American shipyards, watched assembly lines stretch beyond what Japanese engineers could imagine, and studied U.S. steel production statistics with the precision of a mathematician. He had warned Prime Minister Kano, "In the first 6 months I will run wild, but after that I cannot guarantee success." Now, with the operation complete, his fear solidified into certainty. It was then, according to accounts passed down among his staff officers, that Yamamoto spoke the line that would echo across history. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." It was not resignation. It was recognition of American capacity, of Japan's fragile logistics, of an air arm unmatched in skill but irreplaceable in losses, of oil stocks that could not be replenished. The admirals of Japan understood that Pearl Harbor had opened a door that could never again be closed. And yet even they did not foresee what American divers would find beneath the harbor's burning waters. Discoveries that would soon reach Japanese intelligence, and that would begin shattering the illusion of a decisive and permanent victory. When the last Japanese carrier aircraft disappeared over the southern horizon, Pearl Harbor was still burning. The harbor itself seemed to groan like a wounded beast. Towers of black smoke rose thousands of feet into the air, drifting westward and casting a choking shadow over Honolulu. The air stank of oil, cordite, salt water, and burning steel, a smell that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. Below that column of smoke lay the shattered remains of America's Pacific battleship force. The USS Arizona, torn open by a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb that detonated her forward magazine, had split in two. More than 1,100 men remained trapped inside her sunken hull, the deadliest single moment in U.S. naval history. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma had rolled completely over, her masts punching up through the water as if reaching for air. 429 sailors were sealed inside, many pounding desperately against the hull for hours before the sound faded. Along Battleship Row, the scene was apocalyptic. West Virginia burned stem to stern before slowly settling into the mud. California, flooded and listing, had to be abandoned. Nevada, attempting to escape the harbor under her own power, beached herself at Hospital Point to avoid sinking in the channel. Every few seconds, another explosion echoed across the water as ammunition stores ignited. Rescue crews fought through firestorms and collapsing superstructures. Divers descended into pitch-black compartments filled with debris and fuel oil. Cutting torches hissed as they sliced through steel plates, the heat reflecting across the oily water. Survivors later recalled the eerie sound of tapping coming from inside capsized hulls, men still alive, waiting, hoping. But amid the devastation, something else, something critical, began to reveal itself. The Japanese attack had missed the very targets that would determine the outcome of the entire Pacific War. The American aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga were all at sea. By pure timing, the ships Yamamoto most feared losing had escaped the blow entirely. And more than that, the fuel depots containing millions of gallons of aviation gasoline stood untouched. The gigantic above-ground tanks, lined up like rows of vulnerable white domes, were still full. Pearl Harbor's dry docks and machine shops, the industrial heart of the base, were unscathed. Within days, the first assessments began circulating. Several battleships thought lost forever were, in fact, salvageable. American divers, engineers, and shipyard crews worked around the clock, pumping air into flooded hulls, patching torpedo holes, clearing wreckage. The scale of the work was unprecedented, but the facilities to do it had survived. Of the 8 battleships damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor, 7 would eventually return to service. And remarkably, Pearl Harbor's repair capacity, which Japanese planners believed would be crippled for years, was operating again in a matter of weeks. Welding sparks flickered across the docks by Christmas. By early 1942, cranes and floating derricks moved across the harbor with relentless efficiency. Many ships that had been written off by Japanese intelligence were already rising out of the mud. When the first photographs and reconnaissance reports from spies and consular contacts made their way back to Tokyo, the mood inside the Naval General Staff changed dramatically. Gone was the early euphoria. In its place came a grim, tightening disbelief. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, after reviewing photographic evidence of refloating operations, summed up the growing dread. "We smashed ships, but not their ability to build them again." Another senior admiral observed bitterly, "We won a battle, not the war, perhaps not even a full day." The flaw in the Pearl Harbor plan was becoming undeniable. Japan had inflicted a tactical catastrophe, but had failed to deliver a strategic death blow. America's industrial base remained untouched. Its carriers were still afloat. Its repair yards were roaring back to life. And its population, once isolationist and divided, was now united in fury. The victory that had stunned the world was already unraveling. And as Tokyo processed this new reality, Japan's most feared admiral, the man whose strategic instincts were unmatched, was summoned by the high command and confronted with a single question. What comes next? In the days after the attack, Tokyo's naval headquarters grew darker, not in lighting, but in mood. Outside, the Japanese public celebrated a victory unlike any in their nation's history. But inside the war rooms of the Imperial Navy, the men who understood the true scale of the conflict felt no triumph at all. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, delivered his warning with the same quiet precision he used to study enemy fleets. To Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, he repeated the line he had first given months earlier. "For 6 months I can run wild. After that I have no confidence." It was not humility, it was mathematics. Japan's naval air arm, the elite Kido Butai, had been built over decades. Its pilots were among the finest in the world, trained through a grueling system that produced only a small number of combat-ready aviators each year. Every one of them represented thousands of hours of flight time and irreplaceable experience. In contrast, American pilot training programs were already expanding, and the United States possessed the industrial power to put hundreds of new aircraft into the sky every month. Then there were engines. Japan could produce only a fraction of the aviation engines America could. And most troubling of all, the Imperial Navy's fuel reserves were finite, enough for perhaps 18 months of major operations. Every carrier strike, every patrol, every long-range sortie burned away precious days of war. This reality weighed heavily during the tense strategy meetings that followed Pearl Harbor. Maps covered the long tables, the Aleutians, the Central Pacific, the Coral Sea, the Indian Ocean, all now potential battlegrounds. Red flags marked recent victories. Blue flags marked American bases. The distance between them narrowed with every passing hour. Some officers argued that the next strike must target the American carriers, wherever they could be found. Others pushed for an offensive at Midway, a move to lure the U.S. fleet into a decisive battle. A few suggested the unthinkable: negotiate a settlement while Japan still held the advantage. Admiral Yugaki, Chief of Staff to Yamamoto, wrote in his diary with chilling clarity, "Our victory is brilliant, and our defeat equally certain." He was not alone in his pessimism, but no one dared speak too loudly. The weight of Bushido, the warrior code that defined duty, loyalty, and sacrifice, pressed down on every man in the room. To doubt the war was to doubt the empire. To question the strategy was to question the emperor himself. So the admirals kept their voices measured, their expressions still. But inside, they wrestled with a truth they could not ignore. They had crossed into a war Japan was not built to sustain. The atmosphere in those meetings bordered on suffocating. Dimly lit rooms filled with cigarette smoke and the soft rustle of paper. Officers leaned over maps covered with red markers, tracing lines of advance that stretched Japan's fuel and manpower to their limits. Casualty projections lay in neat stacks, numbers so grim that some commanders quietly slid them aside. Still they planned. They calculated. They spoke in calm tones about thrusts into the Pacific and defenses across Micronesia. But in the corridors, away from the conference tables, one whispered sentence passed from admiral to admiral, a sentence that captured the tragedy they all felt but could not say aloud. "We have already lost, but the nation does not know it yet." By mid-1942, the glow of Pearl Harbor, once praised in Tokyo as the greatest victory in Japan's modern history, had dimmed into something colder, heavier, and far more complicated. What had begun as a triumph now looked, even to its architects, like the opening chapter of an unwinnable war. The numbers told the story first. As Japan stretched its forces across the Pacific, the United States mobilized with a speed and scale no Japanese admiral had truly believed possible. American factories, aircraft plants in California, steelworks in Pennsylvania, assembly lines in Michigan, thundered to life. The nation that had seemed distant and divided in 1941 became fully unified by early 1942. That year alone, the United States produced 47,800 aircraft. Japan produced 8,800. The imbalance was not merely numerical. American aircraft engines grew more powerful. Airframes became sturdier. Pilot training programs expanded into a vast network of bases and schools capable of replacing combat losses in months, something Japan could not match. Every statistic that crossed the desks of Tokyo's Naval General Staff confirmed the same truth. The industrial tide had shifted beyond anything Japan could resist. And Admiral Yamamoto felt the weight of that tide long before it broke. During carrier operations in early 1942, the Indian Ocean Raid, the Coral Sea maneuvers, the long stretches of steaming across empty blue, officers remembered Yamamoto as quieter than ever. He stood alone on the flag bridge of the Yamato, staring out over the horizon. He had warned his superiors what this war would demand. Now he watched the cost grow clearer with each passing week. Then came Midway. In June 1942, Japan lost 4 frontline fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, along with more than 100 veteran pilots and flight crew. The same men who had trained for years to strike Pearl Harbor were gone in a single afternoon of fire and smoke. The Imperial Navy would never recover them. In internal memos circulated quietly after the battle, one line appeared again and again. The blow at Pearl Harbor now returns to us with interest. The emotional arc of the war had reversed. What began as shock and triumph had become a grim countdown. Japanese intelligence officers tracked American shipbuilding speeds with growing alarm. More carriers, more submarines, more aircraft rolled off U.S. production lines every month, while Japan struggled to replace even its pre-war strength. Pearl Harbor itself became a symbol of Japan's miscalculation. U.S. salvage crews refloated battleships thought lost forever. Dry docks roared with activity. Within a year, ships that had been sunk on December 7th were back in formation, their hulls freshly painted, their guns retrained on the Pacific. Japanese naval observers, reviewing post-attack photographs, later wrote, "We destroyed the past, they built the future." By late 1942, the admirals who had planned the strike understood a bitter truth. Pearl Harbor had not crippled America's ability to wage war, it had ignited it. The attack that was meant to buy Japan time instead gave the United States a purpose so powerful that no strategy could stop it. The smoke that rose over Oahu on that quiet Sunday morning had not signaled the end of American power. It marked the beginning of Japan's own end, a victory that was already lost.